But over 2 days, question after question, he chose not to answer. In fact, he did that 252 times.
There's a magic in a child who wakes each morning with wonder, whose laughter feels like the heartbeat of home. Poppi Worthington was that magic, until trust was betrayed in the darkest way. Critical evidence slipped away, a father's account raised more questions than answers, and the truth was buried in silence. This is the story of a vibrant life, remembered not for the justice she found, but for the justice she never did. Poppi Iris Worthington entered the world on October 20th, 2011 in the town of Barrow-in-Furness in northern England. She was part of a large family, one of 6 children, and shared a special connection with her twin brother. Those who remember her describe a child full of joy and energy, outgoing, spirited, and quick to bring laughter to those around her. She was often the earliest riser in the household, eager to greet her loved ones and begin the day with enthusiasm. Her mother, whose identity has not been made public for legal reasons, became a parent while still in her teens. By the time she met Paul Worthington in 2009, she was raising 3 young daughters. Paul, who was older than she, soon became part of the family, and together they welcomed a son before later having Poppi and her twin brother. The relationship between Poppi's parents was described as complex. At times, Paul lived with the family. At other points, he stayed elsewhere. Despite the changes in living arrangements, Poppi's mother often referred to him as her closest friend and spoke of the support he gave the children. Eventually, the household, which now included 6 children, settled in a modest 3-bedroom home in Barrow, a property rented from Paul's sister, Tracy Worthington. At the beginning of December 2012, little Poppi hadn't been feeling her best. She had cold-like symptoms, was extra tired during naps, and was experiencing some stomach issues that came and went. On the afternoon of December 11th, she seemed especially uncomfortable. During lunch, she suddenly cried out and leaned back in her high chair, appearing to have stomach pain. Her mother comforted her, gently rubbing her belly. Not long after, Poppi's stomach upset continued, and her mom grew increasingly concerned. That evening, around 7:30 p.m., Poppi was tucked into her crib that she shared with her sister. Her mother went downstairs to rest on the couch, while Paul remained upstairs. Sometime after 2 a.m., Poppi's mother remembered hearing her daughter cry out again in a way that reminded her of the discomfort from earlier that day. She also noticed movement upstairs before Paul came down to let her know that Poppi wasn't feeling well and needed a diaper change. A short while later, Poppi's mother was startled awake once more. This time, Paul was carrying Poppi in his arms, and the toddler appeared unresponsive. Emergency services were immediately called, and CPR was attempted while waiting for paramedics. Sadly, despite all efforts, Poppi tragically did not survive. Poppi was rushed to Furness General Hospital, but despite every effort made by medical staff, she was sadly pronounced deceased at 7:07 a.m. One of the doctors who had worked tirelessly to save her described the situation as unlike anything he had previously encountered in his career. When investigators spoke with Poppi's father, he explained his version of events from the night before. He said that around 9:30 p.m., he had gone upstairs with his laptop, spent some time online, and later went to bed. He claimed that not long after falling asleep, he was awoken by Poppi crying. According to him, he went into her room, found her distressed, and brought her into his bedroom to comfort her. He stated that when Poppi showed signs of discomfort, he partially unfastened her onesie to check if she needed a diaper change. Discovering that she did, he placed her on the bed, went downstairs briefly for a fresh diaper, and returned moments later to find her already asleep. Believing she would soon be awake for the morning, he decided not to disturb her. However, just a short time later, he said he reached over, touched her arm, and realized something was terribly wrong. At that point, he alerted Poppi's mother, and emergency services were called immediately. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments means the world to me. Your engagement helps make these stories even more meaningful. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts.
Later, when specialists carried out a post-mortem examination, several concerning findings were brought to light. Medical professionals identified internal issues and previously unnoticed concerns that suggested Poppi may have been in an unsafe environment. While the exact medical cause of her passing could not be determined, her pass was ultimately classified as unnatural. The coroner's conclusion pointed to troubling circumstances that required further investigation. Although authorities were notified almost immediately after Poppi's passing, no formal interviews with family members took place until August of 2013. Prior to that point, investigators collected DNA samples from both parents. One of the samples raised questions, but Paul explained this as being the result of his attempts to clear Poppi's airway while waiting for emergency responders, followed by using the restroom before washing his hands. It was not until the summer of 2013 that Paul Worthington was taken into custody in connection with concerns surrounding his daughter Poppi's passing. Yet despite this development, no formal charges were ever brought forward. From the outset, questions had arisen about how the case had been managed, and these concerns only grew stronger over time. One of the earliest issues noted by observers was how the home had been treated in those critical first hours. Rather than safeguarding the entire property as a potential source of information, only one bedroom was restricted. The rest of the residence remained open to family members, including children, which inevitably complicated any future analysis. Another point of contention involved Paul's personal laptop. He had told investigators he had been using it the night Poppi became unwell, but the device was never taken into police possession. According to Paul, it was later given to a friend, removing what could have been a significant piece of evidence. Despite officers being present at the home, certain household items that could have been important later were not preserved. One example was the last diaper Poppi had worn. Her aunt, Tracy Worthington, who rushed to the property after receiving a distressed call from Poppi's mother, noticed it sitting near the fireplace. Believing it to be unsanitary and unnecessary to keep, she threw it away without further inspection, an action that would later raise questions about the loss of potential evidence. By the time Tracy arrived, both Poppi and her father, Paul, had already been taken to the hospital by ambulance. Poppi's mother shared her own account of events, telling Tracy that her daughter had been awake in her crib, upset but not crying loudly, when Paul first checked on her. According to this version, he went downstairs for a bottle, returned to settle Poppi, and soothe her by rubbing her back. Something later prompted him to look in on her again, and it was then, the family said, that he realized she was unresponsive. In the aftermath, Tracy publicly defended her brother. She expressed her belief that Paul was innocent, emphasizing that critical mistakes by investigators had left him unable to clear his name. In her words, evidence had been misplaced or overlooked, creating lasting consequences for both the case and Paul's reputation. She remarked that regardless of how those closest to him viewed his character, the public association would likely remain, leaving him burdened with a label she insisted was undeserved. When Paul Worthington first gave his account to officers about the night Poppi tragically passed away, authorities did not initially treat him as a person of concern. Even though there were slight variations in his retelling and differences compared to what Poppi's mother described, the matter was considered by one officer to be a deeply distressing family situation, rather than grounds for further criminal inquiry. As a result, early opportunities to look more closely at the inconsistencies were missed. The investigation later became even more complicated due to differing professional opinions. Two separate pathologists reviewed Poppi's case, but they reached contrasting conclusions. One expert indicated that certain findings raised serious concerns and emphasized this to investigators, while another specialist suggested the same indicators could be explained by natural medical conditions. The second opinion further noted that some of the visible concerns might have developed after Poppi's passing, given the time that had elapsed before the examination. These conflicting views created uncertainty at a critical stage of the inquiry.
Questions about the handling of the case also extended to the conduct of law enforcement itself. Two officers involved were later scrutinized for professional failings. One retired before further action could be taken, while the other left the force after being demoted for poor performance. These outcomes highlighted how procedural shortcomings and lapses in judgment left the case without the clarity that Poppi's family and the wider public deserved. By the time Paul Worthington was eventually arrested, the case had already suffered significant setbacks. Several important items had not been preserved in those critical early hours, which meant investigators were left without enough evidence to proceed with charges. The officer who initially directed the inquiry later reflected on these events, admitting that errors had been made, but insisting his team had worked under difficult conditions. He explained that the presence of conflicting medical opinions had complicated their decisions, and while mistakes occurred, he believed at the time their actions could have been defended as reasonable. His words carried a tone of justification, but also of quiet regret, an acknowledgement that what was lost could never be retrieved. In the years that followed, the shortcomings of that investigation were addressed more openly. The chief constable of Cumbria Police publicly acknowledged that Poppi had been let down. He explained that the first responsibility of any officer in such circumstances is to secure the scene and safeguard all possible evidence. Instead, there had been lapses in oversight, and as a result, items that might have proven crucial were never collected. He described this as a fundamental failure, one that allowed doubt and uncertainty to take root from the very beginning. The admission was stark, and it underlined the devastating reality that a family searching for answers had instead been left with even more questions. In December 2014, hopes briefly rose when an inquest was ordered into Poppi's passing. Families often see these proceedings as a chance to finally establish some clarity, but the outcome here was disheartening. After only a few minutes in court, the ruling was delivered. Poppi's passing would remain unexplained. The judge concluded that the findings of an earlier private review were sufficient and chose not to revisit the matter in detail. For many observers, this moment was deeply frustrating. The child at the center of it all, a little girl whose life had barely begun, was left without a definitive explanation for what had happened to her. And perhaps the most difficult irony of all was that the very system designed to provide answers had instead closed the door far too quickly. In July 2015, the High Court ruled that a new inquest needed to be held after the original proceedings were found to have been handled improperly. This second review was far more detailed, with the judge hearing from multiple medical specialists who did not always agree in their interpretations. After weighing the evidence, the judge concluded that concerning actions had likely occurred involving Paul Worthington and his young daughter Poppi. However, he stated that these actions were not believed to have been the direct reason she passed away. Instead, it was suggested that Poppi's tragic passing was the result of unsafe sleeping conditions that limited her ability to breathe, circumstances worsened by the fact that she had not been feeling well at the time. The heartbreaking conclusion was that she was placed down to rest and later covered, but by morning she had not survived. Despite the deeply troubling picture this painted, the court determined that there was not sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges against Paul or any other individual. For Poppi's loved ones, this outcome left many painful questions unanswered, adding to the weight of their grief. The following year, in June 2016, a serious case review sought to examine not only what had happened in Poppi's final moments, but also the broader family history that had shaped her short life. The report revealed that Poppi's mother had endured a difficult childhood marked by instability, loss, and a cycle of neglect stretching across generations. It was also disclosed that Paul Worthington had once been in a relationship with a woman feared to have taken advantage of Poppi's mother, raising further concerns about the relationships and environments surrounding the family. Records showed that child protection agencies had previously been involved with relatives on the mother's side, but had formally stepped away in 2007. Paul, too, had prior contact with services, though his case had been closed as early as 2003. The review acknowledged that while professionals had been aware of vulnerabilities within both family lines, long periods without oversight meant that emerging risks went unnoticed. In the end, the report stood as a sobering reminder of how fragile safety nets can be when families in distress slip through the gaps of the system. In January 2013, although a pathologist raised concerns that Poppi may have been subjected to SA, Child Protection Services decided not to move forward with additional steps at that time. It was only months later, in October of that year, that the remaining children living in the household were taken into care. Meanwhile, the local council sought to limit public discussion by attempting to restrict reporting on Poppi's passing for a period of 15 years, a request the court ultimately rejected.
In November 2017, following years of determination from Poppi's mother, a fresh inquest into her passing was officially convened. This hearing was far broader than those before it, drawing on testimony from 39 individuals, among them Paul Worthington. By then, Paul had been relocated under protective measures after receiving numerous, which reflected how emotionally charged the case had become in the wider community. Investigators also reintroduced a laptop he had used on the night Poppi was found unresponsive. Specialists carried out a meticulous review of the device, covering digital, physical, and forensic angles, but ultimately reported that nothing unlawful had been uncovered. While that finding closed one avenue of speculation, it underscored how much uncertainty remained and how difficult it was to untangle rumor from evidence in such a highly scrutinized case. The court also heard from a detective who had attended the home on the night Poppi tragically did not survive. His account noted that while no obvious visible concerns were observed on her, there were details within the environment that drew attention. He further acknowledged that because the case was not initially treated as a potential criminal matter, certain investigative steps were not taken. Items such as the bedding and the laptop were left in place rather than secured as evidence. In later reflection, those choices came to symbolize lost opportunities, moments when clearer answers might have been possible had the gravity of the situation been recognized sooner. For many listening, this was a painful reminder of how crucial early decisions can be, shaping not only the course of an investigation, but also the trust of a community seeking closure. When the 2017 inquest resumed, Poppi's father, Paul Worthington, was brought into the courtroom under the watch of police officers. Over the course of questioning, he chose not to respond to 252 separate inquiries, instead invoking his right to remain silent to avoid self-incrimination. His sister Tracy later explained that he had done so on the guidance of his lawyer, and added that, in her eyes, years of suspicion had unfairly overshadowed him. She said she needed no convincing of his innocence, believing he had been carrying a heavy burden throughout the process. By the end of the hearings, the court concluded that there were indications Poppi had experienced troubling circumstances before she tragically passed away, but that the failures in the original investigation meant there was not enough reliable evidence to proceed with criminal charges. It was an outcome that left a deep sense of unease, part closure, part frustration. For some, it showed how fragile justice can be when the earliest stages of an inquiry fall short. For others, it left them wondering whether truth itself had been buried beneath mistakes that could never be undone. Cumbria Police later issued a rare and candid statement of regret. The force acknowledged that its officers had failed in their duty to properly investigate the passing of a child, admitting that their approach had denied both Poppi and her family the clarity they deserved. They stated that their central responsibility should have been to provide a voice for the child who could no longer speak for herself. The admission was painful, humbling, and for many, too late. Yet it also stood as a moment of accountability etched into the public record. In March 2018, the Crown Prosecution Service formally announced that no charges would be brought against Paul unless new and compelling evidence came to light. This decision left Poppi's family caught in a limbo of grief and unanswered questions, forced to live with uncertainty long after the headlines faded. Poppi was laid to rest close to her home in Barrow-in-Furness, where she is quietly remembered with love. On what would have been her birthday in 2018, Paul was said to have left a card at her resting place, sharing that she was always in his thoughts. For some, the gesture was seen as tender. For others, it carried a difficult sense of irony. For everyone who followed her story, however, it was a solemn reminder of a child remembered with affection, and of a case that continues to echo with lessons about accountability, trust, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable. This case shows why securing evidence and following proper procedures is vital. Overlooked items, conflicting reports, and poor oversight left too many questions unanswered. By learning from these failures, we can push for stronger investigations and honor Poppi's memory. What lessons do you think investigators should take from this? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories.